She faced ridicule for bringing bread and water to her meal until a wealthy CEO entered the kindergarten dining hall and took a seat next to her. The kindergarten dining hall hummed with the typical chaos of mealtime, a steady blend of clattering dishes, the metallic clink of utensils against plates, and the shrill voices of children vying to be heard. The atmosphere carried a subtle scent of tomato soup and freshly baked bread, yet in one section of the space, distant from the primary clusters of tables, a young girl sat silently alone. 5-year-old Emma Harper had selected the distant end of a modest table, her posture slightly withdrawn, as if attempting to occupy minimal space. Before her sat a plastic vessel containing a single slice of plain bread and a small water bottle, the type purchased in quantity at the neighborhood shop. She pulled at the edges with her fingertips, not from dislike, but because the action provided something to occupy her that didn't demand lifting her gaze. On the opposite side of the space, at a table crowded with children, several sets of eyes continuously glanced her way. They murmured initially, their expressions contorted into cunning smiles, but eventually the snickering intensified. One boy shouted something regarding meager meals for impoverished children, and another giggled audibly enough for the statement to travel. Emma's face reddened, yet she didn't raise her head. Instead, she sipped her water and fixed her stare on the surface as if she could vanish into it. She had discovered that responding only worsened matters. Her mother, Susan, maintained 2 jobs to manage the rent on their cramped apartment and handle the kindergarten expenses. Mornings were consistently hurried, and most days there was insufficient time or funds for anything beyond the essentials. On days when they possessed fresh fruit or cheese, Emma felt as if she carried precious cargo in her lunchbox. But today had been a bread and water occasion, and she understood precisely how it appeared to everyone else. She considered the other children's trays loaded with pasta, fruit containers, and milk cartons, and longed for slightly more variety in her own meal. The cafeteria monitor walked by once, offering her a gentle smile, yet didn't pause. Emma was accustomed to this. She would complete her bread quietly, consume her water, and await the noise to diminish as mealtime concluded. The mockery stung, yet she had discovered how to suppress it alongside the plain bites of her meal. What she remained unaware of, what no one in that boisterous packed space could have anticipated, was that this routine mealtime was about to shift so dramatically that it would alter the trajectory of her existence. That morning had started like any other for Jonathan Reeves, though his calendar included one responsibility he couldn't transfer: a trustee appearance at a kindergarten the company's charitable organization had funded for years. He had participated in occasions like this previously, the variety where addresses were delivered, courteous tours were conducted, and pictures were captured for media statements. Yet it was uncommon for him to invest more than an hour in such a location. Even as his elegant black vehicle turned onto the peaceful street, he was already considering which conversations he could handle on the return journey to the office. Jonathan was the type of individual people recognized immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the composed confidence of someone accustomed to leading meetings that determined the fate of millions. His dark hair was precisely groomed, his light blue suit impeccably pressed, a pristine white shirt underneath it, and a silver timepiece that reflected light whenever he shifted. The kindergarten itself was pleasant but unpretentious. The administrator welcomed him cordially at the doorway, visibly proud to display the enhancements made with the foundation's assistance: recently painted classrooms, new recreation equipment in the yard, and a modest library space with vibrant beanbags. Jonathan listened courteously, acknowledging at appropriate moments, yet his thoughts wandered as he accompanied her from one space to the next. He had completed his portion of philanthropic appearances, and they all seemed to adhere to the same foreseeable sequence until they arrived at the cafeteria. He had anticipated the typical scene: children laughing, conversing, exchanging snacks. Yet what captured his attention was the motionlessness of a solitary figure in the distant corner. A small girl, no older than 5 or 6, sat isolated at the boundary of a tiny table, her blonde hair divided precisely into 2 braids that bordered a face far too solemn for her age. She wore a plain yellow dress, somewhat diminished from laundering, and a denim jacket that appeared a size too large. Before her was a plastic vessel holding nothing except a piece of bread and a small water bottle. Jonathan reduced his stride without intending to, his focus drawn completely to her, and he observed the manner in which her small fingertips were separating pieces of the bread gradually, as if attempting to extend its duration. Surrounding her, the remainder of the cafeteria was vibrant with commotion, yet several children at a proximate table appeared to have targeted her. They murmured to one another, directing looks in her direction, then laughing in brief explosions that made her posture stiffen. Jonathan didn't require hearing the statements to comprehend the sentiment. The administrator was still speaking beside him, indicating the vivid murals decorated on the surfaces, yet her voice receded into the distance. Something in the scene facing him awakened a recollection he hadn't contemplated in years. The vision of himself as a boy, positioned at a cafeteria table with a meal that didn't correspond with anyone else's, experiencing the same type of invisible burden, pressing downward. He recognized he had ceased walking, and the administrator turned to him with a polite inquiry he didn't register. His concentration was secured on the girl in the corner, and in that instant, the remainder of the tour appeared insignificant. Without excusing himself, he advanced toward her, each stride feeling peculiarly intentional, as if he were traversing more than simply the cafeteria surface. He possessed no strategy, no meticulously constructed phrase prepared for this type of moment. All he understood was that something within him refused to walk past and act as if he hadn't observed her. Whatever business had transported him here today, it no longer held nearly as much significance as the quiet, isolated figure with the bread and water. Jonathan arrived at the end of the cafeteria and stopped for a moment, sensing the inquisitive stares of instructors and children on him, though he scarcely registered them. His attention remained concentrated on the young girl in the yellow dress. She hadn't detected him yet. Her focus was on the small fragments she was collecting from her bread, her actions slow and intentional, as if consuming too rapidly might conclude the moment before she was prepared. He could observe the subtle tension in her posture, the manner she hunched somewhat over the table as if defending herself against the commotion and gazes that encircled her. The space was abundant with laughter and dialogue, yet the atmosphere around her appeared motionless, almost isolated from everything else. Without uttering a word to the administrator, Jonathan crossed the final few strides to the serving area. The cafeteria employee blinked in astonishment when he, attired in a tailored suit, selected a plastic tray like every other child in the space. He examined the selections rapidly, selecting a balanced meal, pasta, fruit, a milk carton, not because he was hungry, but because it would permit him to position himself at the same table without emphasizing her insufficient meal. Tray in possession, he turned toward the distant corner, conscious that the space had grown more subdued. It wasn't silence precisely, yet the tone of the conversation had transformed, as if the children were attempting to comprehend why an individual like him was walking toward the girl they so frequently disregarded or ridiculed. When he arrived at the table, he positioned his tray down carefully beside hers. She glanced up in astonishment, her large blue eyes expanding somewhat, as if she couldn't quite accept he was standing there. Up close, he observed the subtle pallor in her face, the variety that originates from missed meals, and the meticulous orderliness of her braids, which communicated to him someone had invested the time to ensure she appeared nurtured, even if other aspects of her existence were more difficult. He lowered himself, so his gaze aligned with hers directly, and his voice mellowed in a manner it seldom did in boardrooms. "Hello? Would you mind if I sit here?" For a moment she simply blinked at him, glancing rapidly toward the table of children who had been murmuring earlier, as if anticipating them to laugh. When they didn't, at least not immediately, she gave a small, hesitant nod. Jonathan slid onto the bench, arranging his tray so it didn't encroach her area. He lifted his fork and commenced eating casually, as if this were the most organic arrangement in existence. The children who had been taunting her were now observing openly, their previous smirks substituted with bewilderment. Several exchanged glances, as if attempting to comprehend why the man in the suit. The instructors appeared equally confused, though no one intervened. He didn't begin with inquiries. Instead, he commenced talking about something unconnected, a narrative from his own childhood, about the day he had mistakenly brought the incorrect meal to school. He portrayed how he had been in a hurry that morning and seized a container from the storage without examining closely, only to uncover at mealtime that it was dog food. He narrated it with a gentle tone, amplifying his younger self's dismay at the revelation, and was compensated with a small giggle from her. It was swift, almost timid, yet it was present, and Jonathan experienced a surprising sensation of comfort at the sound. He presented her a grape from his fruit container, sliding it across the table. She paused, regarding him as if uncertain whether it was genuinely intended for her, and when he acknowledged, she grasped it between her small fingertips and placed it into her mouth. That simple action appeared to alter something in the atmosphere. The tension in her posture relaxed somewhat, and she commenced glancing at him more directly, though still with a variety of cautious inquisitiveness. Surrounding them, the commotion of the cafeteria gradually resumed, though it was different now, less harsh, less saturated with the cruel energy it had possessed earlier. The children at the other table appeared to have abandoned their appetite for teasing, perhaps because they didn't understand how to compete with the quiet authority of an individual like Jonathan selecting her company over theirs. He could observe them turning away, their focus drifting elsewhere, and he understood without having to articulate anything that this small determination to sit here, to dine with her, had transformed the dynamic for the remainder of the day, potentially longer. For Emma, the meal would still conclude, the afternoon would still arrive, yet this moment had left an impression. Someone had recognized her, not merely recognized, but selected her over everyone else in the space. Jonathan didn't yet comprehend why he'd felt obligated to act, yet as he lifted another forkful of pasta, he understood with absolute certainty that walking past her had never been a possibility. As the commotion in the cafeteria expanded back to its customary hum, Jonathan discovered himself examining the girl more thoroughly. She possessed a manner of conducting herself that was both protective and courteous, as if she had discovered that the most secure way to navigate the day was to occupy as minimal space as feasible. He didn't desire to overwhelm her with direct inquiries, so he directed the dialogue toward gentle, safe subjects, animals, preferred colors, the variety of activities she enjoyed playing. She responded in brief sentences initially, her voice gentle, almost evaluating the atmosphere to determine if it was secure to speak. Yet, as the minutes elapsed, something within her commenced to release. She communicated to him about how she enjoyed drawing flowers in the edges of her notebooks, about the swing in the playground that ascended higher than the others, and about a book her instructor had read last week that she desired she could transport home. Jonathan listened attentively, acknowledging and expressing satisfaction in the appropriate places, yet more than her statements, he observed the subtle transformations in her expression. When she spoke about the swing, her eyes illuminated. When she referenced the book, her fingertips curved around the boundary of her bread as if grasping a small desire. He recognized in her a quiet strength that was far beyond her years, and it caused him to consider moments in his own childhood when small acts of kindness from unexpected sources had signified the world. Midway through their dialogue, he accepted the risk of inquiring about her meal. He didn't desire to humiliate her, so he spoke gently, almost as if he were inquiring why she preferred a certain color. "Is bread your preference?" he said with a suggestion of a smile. She gave a slight shrug and said her mom prepared her meal every day, yet sometimes there wasn't much to pack. She stated it without grievance, as if it were a reality like the weather or the hour of day. Something about the casual manner she accepted it caused his chest to constrict. He communicated to her another narrative then, this one about a time when he had exchanged half his meal for a cookie, only to recognize later that the friend had provided him the final thing he possessed to consume that day. He desired her to hear that kindness held significance, even in small transactions. She listened, tilting her head somewhat, as if evaluating the significance of the narrative. When he slid his milk carton toward her, she hesitated again, yet accepted it with a soft expression of gratitude. Jonathan observed that the group of children who had been murmuring earlier were now observing from a distance, their expressions blended with inquisitiveness and something that resembled unease. They appeared uncertain how to process the reality that an adult, and not simply any adult but someone clearly significant, had selected to sit with her. The power balance had shifted in manners they didn't fully comprehend. As the meal period commenced to conclude, an instructor announced that it was time to clean up. Emma meticulously closed her vessel, leaving the final piece of bread untouched, and Jonathan recognized she was preserving it for later. It was a small gesture, yet it communicated volumes about how she existed, extending what she possessed, making things endure. He stood as she slid off the bench, and for a brief moment she glanced up at him in a manner that caught him off guard. It wasn't quite confidence yet it was something proximate, a flicker of acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, he was someone who perceived her. He gave her a small acknowledgement, one he hoped conveyed the significance of a promise he didn't yet understand how to express in statements. When she walked away toward her classmates, he didn't immediately accompany the administrator to the next segment of the tour. Instead, he remained a moment longer, observing her braid-swaying figure vanish into the corridor. He had arrived here today, anticipating to fulfill a routine responsibility. Instead, he discovered himself carrying the vision of a young girl with blue eyes and a meal of bread and water, and the troubling certainty that this would not be the final time he encountered her. Jonathan caught up with the administrator in the corridor, yet his thoughts were still in the cafeteria. He had intended to depart quietly after his appearance, returning to the steady rhythm of conference conversations and contracts, yet something within him resisted walking away. As they passed a small office, he stopped and inquired the administrator if there was time for a brief dialogue about the girl in the yellow dress. The administrator hesitated, her expression tightening, and for a moment Jonathan thought she might decline. Yet after a rapid glance toward a closed door at the conclusion of the hall, she gestured for him to accompany her inside. The office was unpretentious, with a desk accumulated high with folders and a bulletin board crowded with notices. She motioned for him to sit, then lowered herself into the chair opposite. Her voice mellowed when she spoke, as if she were selecting her statements carefully. The girl's name was Emma Harper. Her mother, Susan, was raising her independently. They resided in a small one-bedroom apartment on the boundary of town, and Susan maintained nights cleaning offices alongside several daytime shifts at a grocery store. Funds were constrained, and some months it was a challenge simply to manage rent and utilities. The bread and water meal wasn't an uncommon occurrence. It was the reality on days when Susan had to extend their groceries as far as they would proceed. Jonathan listened without intervening, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. The description portrayed a picture he recognized all too well. His own mother had been in a comparable position once, maintaining 2 jobs after his father departed, and he recalled the manner she had protected her dignity intensely, declining to request for assistance unless there was no other selection. He inquired the administrator whether the kindergarten provided assistance for families in necessity. She clarified that there were programs, yet funding was restricted, and frequently the assistance didn't reach every child who required it. Jonathan's jaw constricted as he considered the ease with which his company transferred millions for projects that held far less significance than this. The administrator added that Emma was an intelligent, well-conducted child, yet she maintained to herself. Some of the other children ridiculed her, detecting the differences they didn't fully comprehend. Instructors intervened when they could, yet they couldn't eliminate the pain of being targeted. Jonathan could visualize it vividly, the quiet discomfort of experiencing separate from everyone else, the manner it persisted long after the day concluded. When the meeting concluded, Jonathan stood, yet didn't immediately depart. He inquired the administrator one more question. Was there a method to assist without making it apparent that the assistance originated from him? He didn't desire Emma or her mother to experience indebted or targeted. The administrator's eyebrows elevated somewhat, as if she hadn't anticipated the question, and she acknowledged, stating she could consider several discrete alternatives. Jonathan walked out into the crisp afternoon atmosphere, with the dialogue still resonating in his thoughts. The appearance had been scheduled as little more than a formality, yet it no longer seemed that manner. He could have communicated to himself it wasn't his concern, that he was simply a passing figure in the girl's existence, yet the vision of her positioned alone with her plain meal refused to diminish. There was a heaviness within him now, a pull toward action he couldn't quite clarify. He had been trained to identify necessities in business and address them efficiently. Perhaps the same skill could apply here. That night, in the quiet of his apartment, he discovered himself opening his laptop and investigating programs for school meal assistance. He considered direct donations, about scholarships, about methods to ensure no child in that kindergarten would ever have to consume bread and water for meal again. Yet it wasn't solely about the meals. It was about the dignity that originated from understanding you were perceived, that someone cared sufficiently to transform your circumstances without demanding anything in exchange. He recognized, with a certainty that startled him, that he was already past the point of simply walking away. Emma Harper, a 5-year-old stranger he had encountered only hours before, had somehow become the center of a determination that might alter both their existences. Jonathan's determination to assist Emma and her mother commenced quietly, almost invisibly, as if he were inserting threads into the fabric of their existences without emphasizing attention to the weave. The morning after his appearance at the kindergarten, he contacted his personal assistant and instructed her to prepare a transfer to the school assistance fund. It wasn't a token amount intended for a photo opportunity. It was sufficient to guarantee that every child enrolled would possess access to free breakfasts and meals for the next 3 years. He emphasized that the donation should be anonymous and that no public acknowledgement was to be made. For him, the point wasn't recognition. It was to ensure that no child, and especially no small girl with braids and blue eyes, would have to confront a meal of bread and water again. Yet, that was only the commencement. Jonathan understood that food security at school was one thing, stability at home was another. Through discreet channels, he discovered more about Susan Harper's situation. Her night occupation cleaning offices compensated poorly, and her grocery store shifts were unpredictable. There were months when she maintained 70 hours and still barely managed her bills. Jonathan could have written a check to manage her expenses, yet he comprehended the danger of one-time relief. It didn't resolve the foundation of the concern. Instead, he commenced working with the HR department at his company to establish a new position, one that would accommodate her skills, provide consistent hours, and arrive with benefits. When the job posting appeared, it was transmitted directly to her through a recruiter who portrayed it as a community partnership initiative. She possessed no idea that the individual who had shared meal with her daughter was the same individual opening this door for her. While those plans advanced forward, Jonathan discovered himself considering Emma more frequently than he anticipated. He organized his schedule so that he could occasionally visit the kindergarten under the pretense of examining the foundation's projects. On those appearances, he would locate her in the playground or in the reading corner, typically with a book in her lap, her expression absorbed. He never remained long enough to make it apparent, yet each time he encountered her, he experienced that same pull he had experienced in the cafeteria, an instinctive necessity to ensure she was secure, that her small world was expanding rather than contracting. One afternoon, approximately 2 weeks after their first meeting, Jonathan returned to the school with a delivery. It wasn't a lavish present, simply a collection of art materials, colored pencils, sketch pads, watercolor sets, labeled for the entire class. He recalled her communicating to him she enjoyed drawing flowers, and while the present was for everyone, he understood she would discover herself among the colors and paper. From the window of his vehicle as he departed, he captured a glimpse of her holding a fresh sketch pad, her fingertips tracing the cover like it was something uncommon and delicate. Even as he advanced forward with these actions, Jonathan wrestled with an unfamiliar caution. In business, his moves were bold and direct, designed to be recognized, yet here he desired the opposite. He understood how dignity could solidify into resistance, especially for someone like Susan, who was carrying the burden of raising a child independently. He also understood that children detected the difference between charity provided out of sympathy and assistance provided out of respect. Every determination he made had to originate from the latter. By the conclusion of the month, Susan had been interviewed for the position he had established and provided the occupation. She accepted with comfort, perceiving it as a long overdue piece of good fortune. With steady hours and a fair salary, she was able to abandon her night cleaning occupation, and for the first time in years, she was home to read to Emma before bed. Jonathan discovered of this from the school administrator, who referenced how much happier Emma appeared in recent weeks. He didn't accept credit. Instead, he filed the information away like a quiet victory, the variety that didn't require applause. Still, Jonathan was conscious that funds and resources could only accomplish so much. What he had observed in that cafeteria was more than hunger, it was isolation. That was more difficult to mend, and it wasn't something he could address from the shadows forever. He didn't yet understand how or when, yet a part of him was already planning for the moment when Emma would comprehend that the individual who had positioned beside her with a tray of pasta wasn't simply a stranger passing through her existence. He was someone who had determined, in that single moment, to step into it and remain. It was a Saturday afternoon when Jonathan visited Susan's apartment for the first time. The appearance wasn't planned as a grand gesture. He had stopped by to deliver some paperwork for her new occupation that required a signature, and she had invited him in for coffee. The building was aged yet clean, the variety of place where tenants looked after what little they possessed. Inside, the space was small yet orderly, with a single living room that functioned as a dining area and a narrow corridor leading to the bedroom Emma and her mother shared. The scent of fresh laundry hung in the atmosphere, and on the surface above a small bookshelf were several framed photographs, moments of an existence Jonathan understood nothing about. As Susan poured coffee, he permitted his eyes to wander, drawn to a particular picture in a simple wooden frame. It displayed a younger Susan, expressing satisfaction broadly, her arm around another woman whose face jolted him with recognition. He stepped closer, examining the features he hadn't observed in years. The dark hair, the familiar eyes. It was his half-sister, Laura. They shared the same father, an individual who had been distant in both of their existences, and though Jonathan had encountered her at family gatherings in his youth, they had abandoned touch long ago. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He turned toward Susan, his voice quieter than before, and inquired about the woman in the photograph. Susan's face shifted, her expression captured between hesitation and resignation. She clarified that Laura was her best friend for many years, and more importantly, Emma's aunt. Jonathan's thoughts reeled as he assembled the connection together. Laura was his sister, which made Susan her close friend, and if Laura was Emma's aunt, that signified Emma was his niece. The math was simple, yet the emotional impact was anything but. Susan positioned herself opposite him, her hands wrapped around her mug, and communicated the remainder of the narrative. Years earlier, Laura had introduced her to Jonathan's father's side of the family, though the connections were complicated and strained. When Laura passed away unexpectedly, Susan discovered herself alone with Emma, selecting not to reach out to Jonathan or anyone else in that part of the family. She hadn't desired charity, and she carried a profound mistrust toward people she believed had turned their backs on Laura when she required them. In her perspective, maintaining her distance was a form of protection. Jonathan listened, the burden of her statements pressing against his chest. He couldn't deny that her perception of the family was accurate. His father had been emotionally absent, and the extended relatives seldom involved themselves in anything that didn't serve their own interests. Yet the idea that his own flesh and blood had been developing just a few miles away without his knowledge struck him in a manner he couldn't easily articulate. He considered back to the day in the cafeteria, to the inexplicable pull he had experienced toward Emma, and now comprehended that some part of him might have recognized her even then, in manners beyond reason. Susan admitted she had observed something transform in Emma after that day, that the girl appeared lighter, more confident. She thanked him for his kindness, though she didn't yet understand the full extent of what he had accomplished. Jonathan didn't correct her or enumerate the manners he had assisted. Instead, he communicated to her simply that Emma deserved to be perceived, that no child should have to carry the burden of being made to experience small. When he departed the apartment, the atmosphere outside seemed colder than when he had arrived. The streets were the same. The city advanced at its customary pace, yet everything in his own world seemed altered. The discovery had shifted his perspective entirely. Emma wasn't simply a child he had determined to assist out of compassion, she was family. The realization filled him with a strange mixture of patience. He desired to communicate to her, to claim the bond between them, yet he also understood it couldn't be hurried. Confidence had to be constructed, not announced. Walking back to his vehicle, he comprehended with absolute clarity that his involvement in her existence was no longer a selection or a temporary action of goodwill. It was a responsibility, one written into his own history without his knowledge. And now that he had discovered her, there was no turning away. A full year had elapsed since that first day in the kindergarten cafeteria, and the transformations in Emma's existence were visible to anyone who cared to examine. She no longer positioned in the distant corner during meal, curling into herself as if she were invisible. Instead, she possessed a regular seat at a long table with friends, her laughter carrying easily over the hum of the space. Her meals were no longer bread and water, yet varied and colorful, packed neatly in a manner that displayed someone had invested the time to consider what she preferred. Susan's new occupation had brought stability into their home, and with it, a sensation of calm that neither mother nor daughter had understood for years. Evenings were now invested together over homework, bedtime narratives, and dialogues that didn't have to compete with the exhaustion of double shifts. Jonathan had remained a steady presence, though never in a manner that overshadowed her existence. He appeared frequently enough for Emma to develop a custom to him, to anticipate him, yet not so frequently that it seemed unnatural or forced. Over time, she had ceased glancing at him with the cautious uncertainty of their first meeting and started welcoming him with the open warmth of someone who understood she was secure in his company. There were small milestones, her excitement when she displayed him her first watercolor painting, her quiet dignity the day she discovered to read a full book on her own, the manner she commenced communicating to him narratives about her dreams for the future, as if he were someone who might assist make them real. The question of when and how to communicate to her the truth about their connection had been a constant burden on Jonathan's thoughts. He understood there would be no perfect moment, no scenario in which such a revelation would be simple, yet he also understood that confidence was something she had to experience before she could fully comprehend. One evening in early autumn, with the atmosphere carrying the subtle scent of fallen leaves, he discovered himself walking with her through the park near her home. She was holding his hand loosely, conversing about the animals she'd observed at school that day, when he recognized he couldn't maintain the truth to himself any longer. He communicated to her about Laura, about his sister, her aunt, and about how he had only recently discovered who she was. He spoke gently, providing her space to inquire questions. At first, she was quiet, processing his statements, and then she inquired if that signified they were family. When he stated yes, she examined his face for a long moment before acknowledging, as if something she'd been uncertain of had just fallen into place. She didn't state much after that, yet when they arrived at her building, she leaned into him for an embrace that persisted longer than customary. Months later, they discovered themselves in the same kindergarten cafeteria where everything had started. The space appeared the same, the tables still small, the light still streaming in from the same high windows. Yet for Jonathan, it seemed like stepping into another lifetime. Emma was no longer the solitary figure in the corner. She was at the center of a table, animated and engaged, her friends leaning in to listen as she spoke. When she observed him enter, she excused herself and approached, a sandwich in her hand. Without a statement, she positioned herself next to him and separated it in half, providing the larger piece to him. "Now it's my turn to share," she stated with a smile that conveyed both mischief and affection. The simplicity of the gesture captured him off guard, flooding him with the recollection of that first day, the piece of bread, and the manner she had attempted to make herself invisible. Now she was here, meeting his gaze without hesitation, completely unafraid to occupy space in the world. He recognized then that his role in her existence had never been about rescue. It had been about establishing the space for her to develop into herself, to experience worthy of being perceived. As they departed the cafeteria together, her small hand slipped naturally into his. The path outside was lined with the first signs of spring, buds pushing through the branches, and the light seemed softer somehow. Jonathan comprehended that his existence had shifted irrevocably the moment he positioned beside her a year ago. It had started with an instinct to provide company, yet it had become a bond that would outlast anything either of them could have visualized. In the quiet between them, there was no necessity for promises. The action of walking forward together was sufficient. For me, the conclusion of this narrative is powerful, because it displays that true transformation frequently starts with the smallest of gestures, a seat at the table, a shared meal, a hand held without releasing. Jonathan's journey isn't framed as a heroic rescue yet, as a slow, deliberate selection to remain, to construct confidence, and to establish an existence where Emma could thrive without experiencing like a charity case. The reveal of their family connection adds emotional significance, yet what truly holds importance is that his commitment to her commenced before he understood the truth. By the time they walk out of that cafeteria together in the final scene, it's apparent that their bond has developed beyond circumstance. It's become selected family, forged from kindness, patience, and the courage to perceive someone fully and refuse to look away.